The merchant who finally acquires his fortune discovers himself miserable. The scholar who publishes his magnum opus finds the achievement hollow. The young man who wins his beloved watches desire dissolve into indifference within months. Here stands the monstrous paradox that poisons human existence. The very act of grasping strangles what we seek. For 30 years I have observed this pattern repeat with such regularity that I can predict a man's suffering 3 months after his triumph as easily as I predict the seasons. Yet the conclusion toward which this observation drives us is so contrary to every instinct, so opposed to all conventional wisdom, that most would rather endure a lifetime of torment than accept it. You must relinquish willing in order to live well. Not merely relinquish this or that particular desire, though that is where the work begins, but penetrate to the recognition that willing itself, the blind striving that philosophers since Plato have mistaken for our glory, constitutes the very root of our misery. What I shall demonstrate in these pages will either liberate you entirely or confirm you as one of the many who prefer comfortable illusion to uncomfortable truth. The choice, as always, is yours. I write to you from long observation of human nature, both others and my own, and what I have witnessed is this. Every man who achieves what he has pursued with intensity discovers within days, sometimes hours, that the achievement is hollow, not because he chose poorly, but because satisfaction itself cannot end suffering. Consider the wealthy Hamburg merchant I observed for 2 decades. He sacrificed health, family, every pleasure for a single purpose, owning the largest shipping concern in the port. When finally he achieved this, when the last competitor had been bought out and his dominance was absolute, I encountered him 3 days later at the Englischer Hof. "Well," I inquired, "you have arrived." But by the second morning I found myself merely noting what else I might acquire. The satisfaction I had imagined lasting forever endured scarcely longer than a good meal. This is not accident, but law. The will operates through us by generating desires that promise satisfaction. Yet satisfaction, when it comes, reveals itself as merely temporary cessation of want. Within hours, or days at most, either boredom descends, that peculiar suffering when the will has no object to pursue, or fresh desires arise, and the cycle begins anew. The merchant now wants a summer estate. The scholar who publishes his magnum opus immediately conceives his next project. The young man who wins his beloved discovers within months that possession has extinguished the very quality that made desire so intense. You have experienced this yourself, though perhaps you have not observed it with sufficient clarity. Recall your last achievement, a promotion perhaps, or completion of some long-sought project. How long did the satisfaction persist before you were thinking of the next thing? If you are honest, you will admit the pleasure was brief, and you quickly returned to your baseline state of discontent merely with a new object to pursue. This recognition is crucial because it destroys the fundamental illusion that the next achievement will be different, that finally you will attain something that brings lasting peace. You will not. The structure of willing existence makes this impossible. Now I must tell you something more difficult still, something that most spend their entire lives avoiding. Your suffering is not accidental. It is not punishment for errors you have made, not the result of unfortunate circumstances, not something that wiser choices could have prevented. Suffering is the inevitable condition of individual existence. To live is to will. To will is to suffer. This equation admits no exception. I observed 2 brothers who inherited identical fortunes from their merchant father. The elder brother lived with exemplary virtue, charitable to the poor, temperate in his habits, devoted to his family, prudent in his investments. The younger squandered his portion on courtesans and gambling, drank excessively, neglected all duty. Within a decade I encountered both, and discovered something that would shock those who believe in divine justice. They were equally miserable. The virtuous brother suffered from constant anxiety about preserving his wealth, from disappointment in his ungrateful children who demanded ever more, from a gnawing sense that despite his righteousness, life had delivered him nothing of lasting value. The dissolute brother suffered from poverty, from disease consequent to his excesses, from social ostracism, but the quantity of their suffering was identical, merely the content differed. This demonstrates a truth that all conventional morality denies. Suffering does not arise from our moral accounts, but from the structure of willing itself. Between three states, consciousness perpetually oscillates. Want, unfulfilled desire, which is pain, boredom desire with no object, which is a peculiar torture, and the recognition that satisfied desire is hollow, which is perhaps worst of all, for it reveals the entire game as deception. Consider your own experience honestly. Can you identify a period of your life, even a single week, when you were free from wanting something you lacked, or from the boredom of having nothing urgent to pursue, or from the disappointment of discovering that what you attained did not satisfy as you imagined? You cannot, for such a period has never existed and never will exist while you identify with the willing within you. Stop asking, why me? Stop searching for what you did wrong that brought this suffering. You did nothing wrong, or rather, your only error was being born as individuated manifestation of will. And that error was not yours to make or avoid. Having shown that achievement cannot satisfy and that suffering is universal, I must now strike at something even more fundamental. Your goals themselves are phantoms. Not because they are unreal as phenomena. The estate is real. The social position is real. The completed manuscript is real, but because they cannot deliver what you imagine. A young physician of my acquaintance dedicated 15 years to achieving a prestigious university position. He refused marriage proposals because courtship would distract from his studies. He worked through illnesses that would have confined others to bed. He sacrificed friendships, pleasures, his youth itself, all for this single purpose. When finally appointed, I visited him in his office. For perhaps 1 week, he experienced satisfaction. Then a profound shift occurred. He confided, I imagined that upon achieving this position, I would feel complete. Instead, I merely see that the position brings its own burdens, its own frustrations. And worse, I recognize that I was not pursuing the professorship for itself. The will was using me to perpetuate itself, disguising this slavery as my personal desire. The will to live has no interest in your satisfaction. It operates through you to perpetuate itself through reproduction, survival, status seeking. It generates desires not to satisfy you, but to keep you striving. Your belief that achieving your purposes will bring fulfillment is the mechanism by which consciousness is enslaved.
Consider any major goal you currently pursue. Imagine you achieve it perfectly. Everything unfolds exactly as you hope. Now project forward 3 months. What will you want then?
If you are honest, you will see that the achieved goal would merely be replaced by new desires. The goal is not genuinely important to you. It is a temporary placeholder for the will's endless striving. I do not suggest abandoning action. The body must act while it persists, but recognize what you are doing. When you pursue your goals with desperate intensity, you are the will's puppet, dancing to its tune, while believing you are expressing your essential self. The moment you see this clearly, that your goals serve the will's perpetuation, not your genuine welfare, something shifts. The goals lose their hypnotic power. Now we arrive at the most shattering recognition of all. The I you believe yourself to be is illusion. The ego, the personality, the sense of being a continuous, substantial self, all of this is Maya, appearance rather than reality. During my Berlin lectures, a particularly obstinate student insisted that his decisions were products of free will, that his identity was solid and permanent, that he knew himself to be the author of his thoughts and choices. I proposed a simple test. Produce at this exact moment a single thought that is not determined by prior causes, not by your education, not by what you read this morning, not by your current digestive state, not by the chain of causation stretching back to your birth. He sat in silence for a long minute, his face betraying increasing discomfort. Finally, every thought that arises comes unbidden. I notice them appearing, but I do not create them. They emerge from somewhere beyond my control. And yet, I pressed, you claim to be the author of these thoughts, the substantial I. Who thinks? Another silence then. When I search rigorously for this I find only the thoughts themselves, arising automatically. The thinker I imagine myself to be is nowhere to be found. This is direct observation, not philosophy. Attempt it yourself. Where is the I that supposedly experiences your life? Search for it now, with the same rigor you would use to find a misplaced object. You will discover sensations in the body, but these change constantly, and you existed as different bodies across your lifetime. You will find thoughts, but these arise automatically from causes you did not choose. You will encounter emotions, but these fluctuate with weather and digestion. You will note memories, but memories are reconstructions, often false, and in any case they are not you, but merely phenomena you observe. The I is a construct. An interpretation consciousness imposes upon a flux of sensations, thoughts, and mental states that have no inherent unity. Your body replaces all its constituent matter across 7 years, yet you maintain the illusion of continuous identity. This continuity is a story told about disconnected states, not a fact about reality. Why does this matter? Because when you recognize that the you who suffers is itself illusory, suffering loses its ultimate claim. You observe it as phenomenon occurring in consciousness rather than something happening to your essential being. If the individual self is illusory, what lies beneath this appearance? The answer leads us to the metaphysical foundation of all existence. The will, not your personal faculty of choice, but the universal force underlying all phenomena. Walking daily along the main river, I observed a spider spinning her web with absolute absorption. She worked with what appeared to be purpose and intelligence, creating an intricate structure perfectly designed to trap prey. Yet she understands nothing of why she does this. She is driven by instinct, blind, unconscious impulse that she neither comprehends nor can resist. A merchant passing by remarked, "Look at that industrious creature." I replied, "You differ from that spider only in degree of consciousness, not in the fundamental fact that both of you are instruments through which the will operates." As they always do when told their purposes are not self-chosen. My business ventures are products of rational calculation, he insisted. I am not driven by instinct like a spider. I ask him, did you choose to want success? Did you decide through some process of pure reason to desire wealth and status? Or did these desires arise in you unbidden, and you merely constructed rational justifications afterward? He fell silent, then admitted, the desire for success was always there. I cannot recall choosing it. It simply is the thing I want. Precisely, I told him. That desire is the will operating through you. You experience it from within, and because it is your only perspective, you mistake it for your essential self expressing itself, but it is not. It is the universal will, the same force that drives the tree toward sunlight, the predator toward prey, the planet in its orbit manifesting through your particular form. This is not metaphor, but precise metaphysics. The will I speak of is the thing in itself, reality's inner nature. It is blind, having no awareness or purpose, aimless striving, without goal, and universal. The same will underlies all existence. When you feel desire arising for food, for sexual congress, for status, for security, you are experiencing from within this cosmic force that cares nothing for your individual welfare, but only for its own perpetuation. Understanding this reveals why ordinary efforts to control desire fail. You are attempting to use the will to overcome the will, which is logical impossibility. Only recognition, not effort, produces genuine denial. The world you experience exists in two entirely different ways simultaneously, and comprehending this double nature is essential for liberation. On one hand, reality possesses an inner essence, the will, which I have described as blind, universal, aimless striving. On the other hand, reality appears to consciousness as phenomena, separate objects in space and time, bound by causality, structured by the principle of sufficient reason. During my winter in Weimar with Goethe, we disputed his color theory vigorously. He insisted that colors are objective properties of light itself. Through careful demonstration, I showed him that colors exist only as representations in consciousness, the subjective mode by which we experience certain wavelengths of light. Light itself, the will objectified at a particular grade of manifestation, has no color. Color arises only through the organ and categories of knowing that structure, perception. So, Goethe finally understood the world I see is both there and not there, existing as thing in itself, but appearing only through the structure my consciousness imposes. Precisely, I confirmed. The tree before us is real as will objectified, real as phenomenon in space and time. But the separation between this tree and that tree, between tree and observer, between past and future, all this belongs to the world as representation, not to reality's essence. This distinction explains why individuation is ultimately illusion. Space and time create apparent separation between beings, but space and time are not features of the will itself. They are conditions of how consciousness represents reality. At the deepest metaphysical level, there are no separate individuals. There is only the unitary will manifesting through countless temporary forms, each believing itself fundamentally distinct from others. Consider two men in violent conflict, each attempting to destroy the other to secure his own interests. From the phenomenal perspective, they are separate beings with opposed goals. But from the perspective of the will, they are one, the single will at war with itself, through the illusion of individuation. Their conflict serves only the will's perpetuation through competition, natural selection, the cycle of violence that ensures nature's endless striving, while bringing genuine satisfaction to neither combatant. This is not mysticism, but precise observation. Your essential being is not the phenomenal form you inhabit, but the universal will itself. Understanding this makes letting go possible. For what you release is merely identification with a temporary appearance, not your actual essence. Having established the metaphysical foundation, we now turn to the practical path of transformation. The journey begins with a single recognition that overturns ordinary consciousness. Your suffering is not accident or injustice, requiring explanation, but necessary consequence of existing as individuated manifestation of will. A gentleman of my acquaintance, a successful merchant, lost his considerable fortune in a banking collapse. The firm's partners had mismanaged investments catastrophically, and his wealth dissolved within weeks. For months he raged. He raged against the specific partners responsible, against the economic conditions that made the collapse possible, against his own past decisions, against fate itself. He could not sleep for rehearsing what he might have done differently. He tortured himself with endless, if only, scenarios. I encountered him 6 months after his loss. He appeared aged 10 years, hollowed by his mental agitation. Yet something had shifted. I have discovered something, he told me. The torture is not actually the loss of money. I am tormented by my ceaseless demand that reality be other than it is. Even had I retained my fortune, I see now that different sufferings would have found me anxiety about preserving wealth, disappointment in my children, fear of death. The loss merely revealed what was always true. I suffer not because of particular circumstances, but because I am a willing being, and willing is suffering. This is the first crucial turn, from viewing your suffering as particular problem to be solved, to recognizing it as universal condition to be understood. When misfortune strikes, observe your mind's immediate movement toward assigning blame, toward finding causes, toward constructing narratives of what went wrong. This is consciousness attempting to maintain the illusion that suffering is avoidable through correct choices. Instead, ask yourself, is this suffering different in kind from what all conscious beings experience, or merely different in content? The merchant's financial anxiety, the mother's grief when children depart, the invalid's pain, the disappointed lover's anguish, all are manifestations of the same essential condition, not because circumstances are identical, but because all arise from the structure of willing existence itself. This recognition does not console you or not less alone, but it removes the secondary torture, the agitation of believing things fundamentally should be otherwise, the exhausting hunt for particular causes, the self-recrimination that adds guilt to pain. Accepting suffering as universal opens the second stage, systematically destroying the illusion that goals deliver what they promise. This cannot be accomplished through belief or intellectual acceptance, only through rigorous self-observation conducted with scientific detachment. A young scholar spent 7 years completing his comprehensive treatise on natural philosophy. Every page was labored over, every argument refined through countless revisions. He imagined publication would crown his efforts with lasting satisfaction, that finally, after years of sacrifice, he would experience the peace of completed purpose. When the volume finally appeared, I visited him to inquire about his state. For perhaps 2 days, he confessed, I felt a kind of pleasure, but even in those initial hours, I noticed something disturbing. The satisfaction was not from having reached the goal, but merely from the temporary cessation of want. By the 3rd day, I was already conceiving my next project. The achievement did nothing. It merely perpetuates the cycle. This observation is crucial, but most allow the insight to slip away, quickly investing fresh goals with the same illusory promise the previous goal failed to deliver. The will ensures that consciousness forgets each revealed deception and begins anew, convinced that this next achievement will be different. To break this pattern requires deliberate practice. After any achievement, no matter how small, pause and observe precisely what occurs in your consciousness. Note the duration of satisfaction, typically hours, occasionally days, never permanent. Note what replaces satisfaction, either new desires arising immediately or boredom when no object presents itself. Note the quality of the satisfaction itself. Is it genuine contentment or merely relief from the pain of want? Keep a written record. Before pursuing any goal, document what you imagine the satisfaction will feel like and how long you expect it to last. Then, when you achieve it, document the reality. You will discover a stark pattern. Anticipation promises far more than achievement delivers. The gap between imagined and actual, satisfaction, is the measure of your illusion. This is not to stop pursuing goals, but to cease believing their achievement will end your suffering. You will continue acting, the body must act while it persists, but you will no longer organize your entire existence around the deceptive promise that the next achievement will finally bring peace. The third stage of recognition is the most shattering, realizing that not only are your goals illusory, but the you who pursues them is equally so. The sense of being a unified, continuous, separate self must be recognized as interpretation imposed upon flux, not as fact about reality. During my lectures, I would conduct a demonstration. I asked students to sit quietly and search rigorously for their essential self, the I that supposedly experiences their life. Examine your body, I instructed. Is that you? Most quickly realize that the body changes constantly. The flesh you inhabited 10 years ago has been entirely replaced. You existed as different bodies across your lifetime, yet maintained the illusion of being the same person. Then examine your thoughts. Are those you? But thoughts arise unbidden from causes beyond your control. Your education, your reading this morning, your current digestive state all determine which thoughts appear in consciousness. You do not create your thoughts. You merely witness them arising. Perhaps your memories then. But memories are reconstructions that shift with each recollection. What you remember of yesterday has already been edited, simplified, interpreted. Moreover, memories are not you. They are phenomena you observe, contents of consciousness, rather than the consciousness itself. Your personality. Surely, but personality changes with circumstances, with age, with what you ate for breakfast. The traits you consider your essential character were shaped by forces entirely beyond your choice, your heredity, your upbringing, chance encounters that might easily have been different. One student, having searched honestly, finally admitted, "I cannot find this I anywhere. When I look for the thinker, I find only thoughts. When I search for the experiencer, I find only experiences. The solid, permanent self I imagined I was is nowhere to be found as an entity, only as a concept referring to a collection of changing phenomena." This recognition is liberating because when you see that the you who suffers is itself a construct, suffering loses its ultimate claim. You observe pain as phenomenon occurring in consciousness rather than as something happening to your essential being. This creates the space necessary for genuine letting go, for you cannot let go of what you are, but you can cease identifying with what you are not. Having traversed the three fundamental recognitions, we arrive at practical embodiment. How does one actually live with this understanding amid bodily needs, social obligations, and worldly engagement? I observed two physicians treating identical cases of consumption in Frankfurt's hospitals. The first treated with desperate intensity. His entire being was invested in the patient's recovery. He lay awake calculating new remedies, adjusting treatments hourly, taking the patient's decline as personal failure. When death finally came, he was nearly destroyed, not from compassion, but from identification with outcome. The second physician treated with equal skill, but different quality entirely. He was attentive, competent, thorough in his care. He tried every remedy his knowledge suggested. Yet there was an unmistakable equanimity in his bearing. When his patient died, he mourned appropriately, acknowledging the tragedy of a life cut short, but he was not shattered. He accepted what he could not change while doing fully what he could. "How do you maintain such peace in the face of death?" I asked him. His answer was illuminating. "I do not maintain it. It arises naturally when one ceases to. Identify one's own worth with outcomes beyond one's control. I am not indifferent to my patient's suffering, but I recognize that I am not the cause of their disease, nor am I the determiner of whether they survive. I do what is appropriate to my position and capacity, but the result does not define my essential being. This is the quality of resignation I describe. Action without the fever of personal investment. The resigned person writes correspondence, but does not lie awake wondering if the recipient will respond favorably. They attend dinner parties, but do not scheme to impress influential guests. They complete projects with full attention, but do not require success to feel their existence is justified. Most mistake this for indifference or lifelessness, but observe carefully and you will see the opposite. The physician, free from desperate attachment to outcomes, was actually more attentive than his frantic colleague, for his perception was not clouded by the need for particular results. He could see circumstances clearly, could make better decisions, could act with appropriate care, precisely because he was not enslaved by hoped-for outcomes. This is how one lives without wanting, not by ceasing to act, but by acting without identification with results. When you cease identifying with your individual will, a remarkable transformation occurs in how you perceive other beings. Since the will is universal and individuation is illusion created by space and time, the suffering you observe in others is fundamentally identical to your own, not similar, but identical at the metaphysical level. Walking through Frankfurt's poorer districts one winter, I encountered a beggar whose circumstances I might easily have ignored another unfortunate among thousands. But I paused and looked carefully, not at his material condition, but at what manifested through his form. I saw the same will suffering that I experienced. The hunger, the cold, the desperate wanting, the fear of death. In that moment of recognition, the distinction between his welfare and mine collapsed. I gave him what coins I carried, but the act was not from duty or from the superior position of the fortunate bestowing charity upon the unfortunate. It arose from recognition that there was, at the deepest level, no other. The will suffering in his form was the same will suffering in mine. Only the phenomenal appearance, the particular body, the specific circumstances differed. The essence was identical. This is not sentiment, but metaphysical fact. The principium individuationis, the illusion that you are fundamentally separate from others, dissolves when you recognize that individuation belongs to the world as representation, not to the will itself. Space and time create apparent separation, but space and time are merely the conditions of how consciousness represents reality, not features of reality's essence. Consider someone you typically regard as enemy or rival. From the phenomenal perspective, their interests oppose yours. But shift to deeper vision. The anxiety they feel about their position is your anxiety in different form. Their hunger for recognition is your hunger, wearing different content. Their fear of failure is your fear. The will striving through their body toward its blind purposes is the same will striving through yours. When you truly see this not as intellectual proposition, but as lived perception, genuine compassion arises spontaneously, not pity, that condescending emotion of the fortunate toward the unfortunate, but recognition of shared essence. You cannot harm another without experiencing it as self-mutilation, for at the deepest level there is no other to harm. This transforms moral behavior entirely. You act ethically, not from fear of punishment or hope of reward, but from the direct recognition that in causing suffering to any being, you cause suffering to yourself. The willing consciousness lives perpetually between regret and anticipation, never actually present. The past haunts with its memories of opportunities lost. The future beckons with imagined satisfactions not yet attained. The present moment is merely a thin passage between what was and what might be, barely noticed in consciousness's rush toward the next thing. I observed a mother whose children had grown and established their own households. The first weeks after their departure, she existed entirely in two temporal modes. Either she was reliving their childhood, dwelling on moments past with bittersweet intensity, or she was anticipating their next visit, imagining conversations not yet occurred, planning meals she would prepare. She was never actually present to her current life. After some months, having exhausted both memory and anticipation, something shifted. I found her one afternoon simply sitting by her window, watching light play on the main surface. "What are you doing?" I inquired. Her response was striking. "For the first time in decades, I am actually here. Not mentally replaying the past or rushing toward the future, just present to this moment. And I have discovered something remarkable. When you are actually in the present, rather than constantly rushing through it, there is a quality of peace I had never known. This is what resignation offers, release into the present. When you cease to will, there is nowhere else to be. Future-oriented consciousness anticipates satisfaction of desires not yet fulfilled. Past-oriented consciousness regrets opportunities missed or clings to satisfactions that have dissolved. Only the consciousness freed from willing can rest in what is. Consider your own mental state right now. How much of your consciousness is actually present to this moment versus occupied with past memories, regrets, nostalgia, or future plans, anticipations, anxieties? If you observe honestly, you will discover that genuine presence is rare. Most of consciousness is perpetually elsewhere. This is why aesthetic experience provides such profound relief. When you contemplate great music or a sublime landscape, you temporarily cease willing. You are not using the experience to achieve some future satisfaction. You are simply present to it. In those moments, time loses its tyranny. You exist purely in the now, and in that existence is peace. Practice what I call presence moments. When drinking your morning coffee, actually taste it not while planning. not while remembering, just taste. You will discover something available all along, but missed in the constant forward motion of willing. The fear of death drives much human behavior, the scramble for legacy, the denial of mortality, the desperate grasping at additional years. Yet this fear rests on fundamental confusion about what dies and what does not. I have sat with several individuals in their final days, not as physician, but as philosophical companion. One gentleman, a merchant, who had spent his life in furious accumulation, faced his death with absolute terror. He clung desperately to additional days of consciousness, bargaining, raging, unable to accept the dissolution approaching. Another man, a simple tradesman who had somehow grasped these truths, faced his end with remarkable equanimity. "How is it you can be so peaceful?" I asked the tradesman as he lay on his deathbed. His response illuminated everything. "I am not dying. This particular form, this body, this personality you call Wilhelm, is dissolving, yes, but I was never truly this form. What I essentially am was never born and cannot die. Birth and death belong to the phenomenal realm, to the world as representation. The thing in itself, the will that manifests through this temporary form, is indestructible. Consider what actually dies. The body perishes, returning to elements. The personality, that collection of habits, memories, preferences you call self, dissolves. But were these ever your essential being? Your body has already replaced all its matter countless times. You have existed as different bodies. Your personality has shifted continuously since childhood. What you took to be your permanent self has always been flux, interpretation imposed upon change. The will itself does not die. It continues its blind striving through countless other manifestations. More profoundly, your essential being, when you recognize that you are not the individuated form, but the universal substrate from which all phenomena arise, was never born and cannot perish. This understanding does not make death welcome. The body instinctively recoils from dissolution. This is the will to live, operating through organic form. But it removes death's sting of existential horror. You cease believing that your personal continuation matters to the cosmos, and in that recognition is peace. Moreover, understanding death transforms living. When you truly accept mortality, trivial concerns lose their power. Status, reputation, petty slights, all revealed as absurd when viewed against the certainty of death. What matters becomes clearer. Minimizing suffering, acting with compassion, pursuing truth. What doesn't matter falls away. You have been taught to fear meaninglessness, to believe that without grand purpose, existence becomes unbearable. I tell you the opposite is true. What you feared as loss of meaning is actually released from the tyranny of false meaning. A scholar I knew spent 40 years attempting to demonstrate that history shows progress toward higher moral development, that human existence has purpose and direction. His magnum opus argued that suffering decreases across generations, that consciousness evolves toward greater enlightenment, that all the blood and brutality of history serves some ultimate good. When his health failed, and he reviewed his life's work with the honesty approaching death permits, he recognized it as elaborate rationalization. Consciousness attempting to impose meaning on the will's aimless striving. I spent 4 decades, he confided, fighting against the truth that existence has no purpose. I could not accept that all this suffering, all this striving, leads nowhere, serves no grand design. But now, accepting it, I am oddly at peace. I am freed from the burden of needing life to mean something it never could. This is the profound recognition. The will that underlies existence has no purpose, no goal, no justification. It simply wills, perpetuating itself through endless cycles of desire, satisfaction, new desire, without any of this serving a larger meaning. The purpose is you construct your personal legacy, your contribution to progress, your place in some divine plan. Our consciousness's attempt to rationalize what is fundamentally aimless. Understanding this is not nihilistic despair. Nihilism is the anguished belief that lack of inherent meaning makes life not worth living. What I describe is different. The recognition that existence never had the kind of meaning you imagined, and that accepting this is liberation, not tragedy. You can still act, love, create, alleviate suffering, not because these have cosmic significance, but because they are what consciousness does while manifesting, and some ways of manifesting cause less suffering than others. You need not organize your entire existence around proving that your life matters to the universe. It does not matter to the universe, which has no capacity to care about such things, but it can matter to you and to the beings your actions affect. Only when you cease demanding that life have purpose can you engage with it freely, without the secondary torture of requiring it to be other than it is. We arrive now at the complete teaching and its ultimate promise. I offer you not happiness, which I have shown to be impossible, defined as it is by satisfied desire, but something far more valuable, peace. Not the peace of the grave, but the peace of value, clear-sighted understanding. I write these words in my 72nd year, from a life that has known both belated recognition and long neglect, intellectual satisfaction and profound loneliness. I can attest from lived experience. The moments when I have achieved genuine resignation, when I have ceased to will even the success of my philosophy, have been the only moments of genuine peace in an existence otherwise characterized by the chronic pain of consciousness. This peace is not happiness. When the book I labored over for years met with public indifference, I suffered. When colleagues I respected dismissed my work as pessimistic nonsense, I felt the sting. But beneath these surface agitations, in moments when I remembered these truths, there was a deeper stillness, the recognition that none of this touched what I essentially am, that the willing within me was not me, that the drama of success and failure was appearance rather than reality. The complete formula is simple. Suffering equals identification with willing. Peace equals observation without identification. Every instant you spend identified with the willing in you, believing your happiness depends on outcomes, your worth is determined by achievements, your suffering is personal, injustice is an instant of torture. Every instant you observe willing without identifying with it, noting, desire is arising rather than I want. Seeing pain is occurring rather than believing I am in pain is an instant of freedom. This is not future promise, but present availability. Right now, observe your consciousness. What are you wanting? Perhaps you want this chapter to deliver some final revelation. Perhaps you want certainty that you have understood correctly. Observe this wanting without judging it, without suppressing it, and without satisfying it. Simply note, wanting is arising in consciousness. In that moment of clear observation, without identification, you taste the peace I describe. It may last only seconds before identification reasserts itself. This is normal. The practice is returning again and again to this observation, training consciousness to recognize itself as witness rather than as the willing it witnesses. This is my final offering, the clarity to see what you are choosing in each moment, identification or observation, suffering or peace.